Today on World Traveler Commentary, I'm going to talk about this day in history and the surrender by the Japanese at the end of World War II. I'm also going to talk about the immediate proxy war that followed from that, not in Europe, but in Indonesia. Indonesia, like much of the colonized world, had a long and lively independence movement from long before World War II. But one of the constraints that the Japanese had operated under is the fact that Japan is a relatively small country and couldn't really conquer and integrate large amounts of territories into their country, so to speak. And so what Japan had managed to do during much of World War II was sell themselves out as supporters of independence and against Western colonialism. Now, what this meant in Indonesia in particular was that while the Japanese occupation was brutal like it was everywhere else, they also provided security for deliberations on the Indonesian constitution. They also worked with the independence movement to build the infrastructure of state and a lot of things like that. So the time of Japanese occupation in Indonesia, while it was very unpleasant, and it's been said that 3 years under the Japanese was longer than 300 years under the Dutch, it carried with it the momentum towards independence. The second thing you have to understand is that the United States' preoccupation at the end of World War II was pretty much identical to Japan's and Germany's preoccupation, which was stopping the Soviet Union. So, what happened at that point, you have to understand, is that the United States started sponsoring independence movements that they liked and opposing independence movements that they didn't like. So, the United States was clandestinely supporting Ho Chi Minh in Indochina, for example, on the theory that he'd be pro-Western and not pro-communist. At the same time, they were really scared of Sukarno because of the fact that Sukarno's coalition for independence included not only nationalists and Islamic scholars and thinkers, but it also included a strong Marxist contingent. And so this scared the United States very badly, and so they began a massive proxy war against the Indonesian independence movement. Sort of seeing the winds change, the day after the Japanese surrendered, Sukarno got on radio and made his declaration of independence. And the reaction from the United States was very, very, very swift. The United States told Japan, who had just surrendered, that under the terms of the surrender, they now had to reconquer Indonesia. The Japanese army in Indonesia began suppressing pro-independence movements. This eventually led to massacres of youth protesters who at that point had been largely peaceful. And in fact, the war crimes that were effectively pushed by the United States for Japan to commit proved so controversial that Japanese soldiers ended up defecting in hundreds or thousands over to the pro-independence movement. Failing this, the United States then convinced the United Kingdom to fight against the independence movement. At the same time, the United States started bankrolling the Dutch reinvasion. So this became a very, very long, bloody proxy war. At the end, hundreds of thousands of Indonesians had lost their lives. And this kind of shows you that the end of World War II wasn't really the end of the conflict. The conflict continued to rage in various forms, only to reignite later in Korea, for example, and echoes of it to come down in Vietnam. The United States lost that proxy war. In fact, it's interesting because the United States has never really won a major conflict which has forced an actual surrender by another government, where that government has been reasonably large and well prepared since World War II. The closest we've had has been the Iraq War, and the aftermath of the Iraq War really showed the limits of American soft power. But the Indonesian War of Independence was a little bit different. I mean, the United States suffered its first major international setback following World War II, and it was like right after World War II. So if you want to understand things that way, World War II was the height of U.S. power. U.S. power has been declining ever since. So, I mean, certainly there are illusions to the contrary, but the illusions are largely caused by power vacuums. The United States outlived the USSR. But I don't think it's going to outlive China. I don't think it's going to outlive the Russian Federation. I don't even know if it might outlive the EU, I don't know. That's going to be an interesting one to watch. But the point here is that the United States waged this long, bloody proxy war in Indonesia. Lost. And they ended up losing for a very interesting reason, and that was that while Sukarno was quite happy to make common cause with Marxists as long as they weren't interested in overthrowing an independent Indonesia, where there were communist parties that were revolutionary and interested in a revolution that wasn't just anti-colonial but was perhaps pro-Soviet, he was not at all opposed to crushing those, even during the independence movement. And consequently, the United States' political support began to falter. Didn't completely collapse. I mean, the United States really kind of fought to the bitter end on this. And after they lost, they still hated Sukarno. They worked tirelessly to undermine the Indonesian government. This meant that rather than developing into a flourishing democracy, you really saw a need for restrictions that were largely aimed at keeping American meddling out. This itself was relatively unsuccessful because eventually the CIA was able to sponsor a coup, depose Sukarno, and began what has been called the Indonesian genocide following that. Somewhere almost certainly between 1 and 3 million Indonesians, largely Chinese ethnic, from the Chinese ethnic minority, were killed largely in the name of stopping communism. Genocide, pure and simple. One of the interesting things that we see today is that there is an effort to portray World War II as not merely the good guys versus the bad guys, but with the United States as the good guys, and then Germany, Japan, and the USSR as the bad guys. The fact of the matter is that big wars have no good guys. Let me say that again. Big wars have no good guys. War is usually between the bad and the worse, it's not between the good and the bad. Certainly, Nazi Germany would certainly classify it as the worst in that regard. But in the pursuit of geopolitics, during and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States did terrible things also. It wasn't just the USSR. The UK did terrible things also. And oftentimes we're missing this in our discussions of our own history. You know, the 1965-1966 genocide in Indonesia directly followed from U.S. foreign policy that began in World War II. And it was all about stopping the communists. In fact, I've seen commentary suggesting that this was so successful we didn't need to fight in Vietnam, justifying the murder of millions of people. It's still a controversial topic. We're now at a point in the history of the world where we're moving away from a world which has been dominated by a dying superpower. The United States became a superpower in World War II and sort of immediately went into the decline. And it achieved a dominance over the world, not because of its own might, but because it collapsed a little bit slower than the other superpower. The aspect of this that's worth noting is that to a very large portion of the world, the Americans are not their friends. And large portions of the world that see the United States as a malevolent hegemon, for lack of a better word, are now developing and coming into their own. This has immense implications for the geopolitics of the coming time. The United States isn't going to pick up additional allies. Indonesia will continue to make common cause with anybody as long as they see common interest and can make common cause. And so there's some limited possibilities there, but you're not going to pick up loyal allies. The U.S. isn't going to pick up loyal allies at this point. On the other hand, now you see a different model emerging in the Belt and Road Initiative, where China basically comes in and says, what's your point of view on Taiwan? And if a country says, well, that's for the two of you to work out, we're not involved, then China's quite happy to invest, of course, for terms that'll provide a return on investment, but under terms that are less unfavorable than the World Bank, the IMF, and sort of the pro-Western financial system, which the United States has tried to maintain its hegemony through. And then you see Russia coming in with their proposal that all these things are internal, and if there's common cause to be made, we're happy to be there, but otherwise. And Russia is certainly not a world power at this point, but they have stopped catastrophe in Syria. So, where I'm going with this is, we're moving to a multipolar world, whether we like it or not. The U.S. should have been aware of the limitations of US power pretty much since the end of World War II, but still struggles with that idea. Proxy wars against the United States don't have much of a history of working out in the US's favor. The one example I can think of initially seemed to be Afghanistan, but we know how that turned out a few decades later. The US just isn't good at waging proxy wars. So the world is now going through a transformation that is larger than the transformation after World War II. The colonial era now is starting to actually become over. World War II just kind of like knocked the supports out from it and began the process. Now we're seeing a massive transformation. And at the same time, the United States, along with the United States' closest allies, are now in decline. There's no way around that point. Even Tony Blair has said that the problem right now is that the United States is in decline and that the West is in decline. The European Union has managed to set themselves up so that they are dependent on everyone, which made a lot of sense in the Cold War because the fear in the Cold War was the United States is going to drag us into a nuclear war with Russia. And so by cultivating, say, a dependence on Russian natural gas, Europe cultivated themselves as a hostage in order to be a stabilizing force in order to prevent this sort of catastrophe. And I don't think many people understand how bad a nuclear war, in fact, would be. Basically, if you look at the models that we have, if the United States and Russia were to hit each other with a bunch of nuclear weapons, leaving aside any fallout questions, leaving aside all the other stuff that people worry about, radiation, yada, yada, yada. Even assuming none of those weapons hit Europe, Europe would be basically uninhabitable. The assumption, basically, the models that we have suggest a temperature drop of 30 degrees Celsius in most continental climates. Now, maybe if you're in Libya, that might not be a bad thing. It might mean agriculture might get a little bit easier. But if you're in Europe and your high temperature in the summer is like 38, and you don't get very many days above 30, that means that you're talking about an ice age. Pure and simple. No agriculture. I don't see how pretty much anybody would survive in Europe. You'd have a similar problem in the United States. There are a few areas of the United States which might be survivable. Certainly Hawaii would probably be okay. It's not a continental climate, it's a maritime climate, so the effects would be less. Florida might be okay. But we don't really know what would happen to the ocean patterns, and that's a question. North Africa might be okay. What's now the Sahara Desert might be subject to reversing that. A lot of sub-Saharan Africa below the tropics would probably be in very serious problems. A lot of continental Africa would probably also be snowed under, even in the tropics. So what I'm trying to get at is we're heading back into a point where we have to sit down and really think about global stability and how to make sure that we cannot have a nuclear war. So how do we do it? We've got to do it by talking to each other. We've got to do it with mutual respect between nations. And yes, that means respecting Russia. It also means respecting Ukraine. But I don't see it happening. At any rate, that's what I have for today. Hope you have a great day despite these sobering thoughts. Talk to you later.